Good afternoon, dear friends. Dr. Pachauri has joined us, and it's a great honor for us to have him here on this International Economic Forum. Climate change and global warming are the major subjects in the world, and it's the sharpest subjects this year because we see extreme events around the world, especially in the United States. Dr. Pachauri probably is the most qualified person in the world who can tell what's happening with the climate. And for about 14 to 15 years, since 2003, he was in charge of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and there was thousands of scientists, researchers who study climate change and global warming and how this is reflected on the weather change in many countries. And this year, the climate problem is maybe the most popular. And Dr. Pachauri and his organization has received Nobel Prize for studying climate. But since then, most people speak of not global warming, but rather of climate change as more general term. Can you share with us what the situation is now and how the scientific communities evaluate the climate change?
Okay, I had actually prepared a PowerPoint presentation, but I'm not going to show that because, this is a small and exclusive audience. So it would be much better for us to have a conversation and discussion. Let me start by saying that the climate of this planet has changed substantially because since the beginning of industrialization, if we look at what we have done to the atmosphere of this planet, then right from a level of 280 parts per million of carbon dioxide, we have now reached a level of over 400 parts per million. That's a substantial increase. And there are other greenhouse gases, which are also the products of industrialization. And all of this put together has led to climate change. And I have always used the term climate change because if you use the term global warming, then it just means the only thing you have to worry about is the warming of temperatures, but they don't quite understand the other implications of climate change. Let me just talk about some of the impacts of climate change. Sea level rise, which is by far the most threatening for a large number of people living in small island states and coastal areas and countries like Bangladesh, which is very low-lying. Just a little while ago in the other session, we heard from someone who's from the Netherlands. We have brought out in the IPCC fifth assessment report how the Netherlands was formed. Over 600 years ago, it was really 3 areas of land which were not connected. And then they decided they would increase the area of land available to them. So they constructed those dikes and kept the sea out, as a result of which they've got a much larger surface area. But of course, the result is that part of it is below the level of the seas. Now, as a result of the melting of the bodies of ice and thermal expansion of the oceans, sea level rise since the beginning of the last century and up to 2010 was an average of 19 centimeters. 19 may not seem like a lot, but if you're living, let's say, in the Maldives Islands or in the South Pacific, there is a nation called Kiribati, which is spelt as Kiribati, but it's pronounced as Kiribati. They have actually abandoned some of their islands because these are just about a meter above sea level, and therefore every time you have an extreme event, every time you have a storm surge or coastal flooding, then these low-lying islands are threatened. I remember it was in 1997, I was elected as vice chairman of the IPCC, and this plenary session was held in the Maldives. And at that stage, President Gayoom was the person in the presidency. He addressed us and he says, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, there were quite a few ladies also, the place where you're sitting today, 2 years ago was under 1.5 feet of water. Because every time you have a storm surge, even though the Maldive Islands are about 1 meter above sea level, the whole place gets flooded. So that sea level rise is one of the major impacts, but there are other impacts on agriculture. The productivity of agriculture is going down as a result, and we have projections of what will happen by the end of the century if we don't do anything. There would be a sharp decline in the productivity of wheat, rice, and corn. And these are the staple crops that are used all over the world and provide nutrition to a large number of people. And you can imagine today our population is about 7.3 billion. By the time it stabilizes, it would be 9.5 or 10 billion. So you'll have many more mouths to feed and a decline in agricultural productivity. And we don't have the land to expand agriculture. There are also serious problems with what is known as the Green Revolution. That's leading to an increase in nitrogen in the atmosphere and in the soils. And researchers are now looking at that. Some of them are even saying, is nitrogen the new carbon dioxide? In other words, this is something we need to worry about. So, we have some serious problems occurring in agriculture and meeting the needs of a large population, a growing population. Another impact is on water availability. Now, precipitation patterns are changing very rapidly. One of the things we projected in a special report in 2011 was an increase in heat waves and extreme precipitation events. Now, the result of heat waves you can see everywhere. You have many more forest fires because you have prolonged periods of dry heat, and therefore anything that triggers a fire will spread it very rapidly. The other thing you see is extreme precipitation events, floods. Floods are taking place everywhere in most unlikely places. And you've seen what has happened in Texas with Hurricane Harvey. That's the other thing we have found, that since 1970, there has been an increase in hurricane activity in that region, and that trend is likely to continue. So overall, the impacts of climate change are going to be very harmful for the human race and all forms of life on this planet. In fact, we have a serious refugee problem in Europe right now, but with the impacts of climate change, this is going to become substantially worse. So we need to be concerned about that. Another area that I want to highlight is the impacts on the oceans. You see, since the beginning of industrialization, 30% of the carbon dioxide that's been produced has been absorbed by the oceans. And that has led to acidification. Also, the oceans are warming very rapidly.
If to tell about numbers, in English, the average temperature of ocean increased in 4 or 5 degrees during the past century, and the average temperature of underwater temperature increased only less than 1 degree, and that's why.
But
that's why we speak about
90% of the heat which has been generated on account of climate change or global warming since 1990 has gone into the oceans. Otherwise, land temperatures would have been much higher. But the result of that is that marine ecosystems and marine life are being affected adversely. You've already seen what's happened to the coral reefs all over the world. They're being bleached at a very rapid rate. But we frankly don't know enough about what's going to happen to life below the oceans. Another issue that I don't want to link to climate change, but has some linkages. You know, there's a beautiful island called Henderson Island in the Pacific. This is supposed to be a World Heritage Site. And today it has tons and tons of waste, including toothbrushes, including plastic bags, which have gone all the way from as far away as South America. So, you know, the amount of waste we are generating.
It's not a climate change, but it has an impact on the climate.
Yeah, no, in a sense it is climate change because we are generating so much waste. We are producing so much, we are consuming so much, and as a result, we are generating a lot of waste. So the point I'm making is we have to change our lifestyles. We have become an extremely wasteful society. And we just go out, we buy things, we use them a little bit and throw them away. And we think the problem is solved, it's gone away. But actually, it all goes to landfills. I can tell you about India. There are 7,500 landfills in India. And you see so many new shopping malls coming up. I can tell you, I never go to a shopping mall because I think these shopping malls are a monstrosity, which are a replica of what you have in the United States. They are not suited to our conditions, but we are so blind, we are just following that pattern. And the whole purpose of this is to make you buy more and more, to consume more and more, which is fine. If it makes people happier, why not? But look at the power of advertising. The advertising budget of the world is between $600 and $700 billion. Nature doesn't have any advertising budget. Anyway, all this is the bad news. Let me just tell you a little bit about projections for the future. If we don't act, and if we don't bring climate change under some degree of control, then by the end of this century, we could have a temperature increase of about 4.8 degrees Celsius. Now that's bad news because clearly that would lead to sea level rise several meters high. Part of the West Antarctic ice sheet could easily break and go. The Greenland ice sheet could break and go into the oceans. And one figure that I want to mention to you is that in September 2050, there will be no Arctic sea ice. Can you imagine the Arctic Ocean without any ice cover? But in September 2050, that will happen unless we act today. These are just some projections I want to show you.
Пане Пачурі, можна уточнення? Ми зараз говоримо про...
Can I clarify about the climate change? We are now speaking about climate change. We are now speaking about the model of climate change, which was calculated based on the number of carbon in the atmosphere. These are studies that have been taking place for 50 years, and major conclusion is that if the carbon emission increases 2 times, the pollution of atmosphere increases 4 times. Will the climate change and global warming also be due to such carbon increase in the atmosphere, or maybe there are some other factors? Maybe the amount of moisture which will go up will create more clouds and will somehow compensate the global warming. Will different factors will be taken into account, or does everything look so linear, or can we forecast only warming based on this effect, or are there maybe other factors, a combination of factors?
Clarify that as far as climate models are concerned, they are very, very sophisticated today. They take all these factors into account. And in fact, what we do is to test the validity of these models is to go back in time. We run the models with all these inputs of solar activity, volcanic activity, greater moisture in the atmosphere, and so on. And when you take these factors into account, you get a certain projection. Then you add the increase in greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, and then you get another projection. When you add both these factors together, you get a projection for the past which fits exactly with what has happened. So the point I'm trying to make is that today's climate models are very sophisticated, very powerful, and you're able to come up with a very clear understanding of what human beings are doing to their climate. Now, if you really want to deal with this problem, then the solutions are very clear. We have to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases by 40 to 70% in 2050. And they should go down to zero or negative values by the end of this century. And we can do that. Now, how do you go to a negative value? Firstly, we have to stop deforestation. We have to expand the area of forests. We have to come up with carbon capture and storage. And most importantly, we have to move to low carbon or no carbon forms of energy supply. And this is where I would like to submit that Ukraine has unique opportunities. And those opportunities also carry what is known as co-benefits. What are the co-benefits? Well, firstly, you'll have lower levels of air pollution at the local level. Secondly, there is every likelihood of much greater job creation with those models, with a renewable energy-based system than a fossil fuel-based system. Then you would also have much higher energy security. And for this country, energy security is extremely important. So the point I'm trying to make is these solutions are within our reach, and we have to start moving in that direction very quickly. One way by which we can do that is to start mobilizing the youth of the world. Because young people still have value systems that are generally open and not biased. And young people, I believe, have an enormous influence on the way adults behave. If young people want something, then adults really cannot ignore that. So let me conclude, and then I hope we can have a discussion. We are now at the cusp of change. And if we really want to make sure that coming generations live under conditions that don't make it very difficult, that don't impose risks on them, then I think we have to start today. Because time is very short. If we don't start today, then the kinds of technologies that would be required, the actions that would be required, will be totally beyond our reach. And we will prove incapable of being able to implement them. So that's basically the message I wanted to give. I've launched a movement called the POP movement, which stands for Protect Our Planet. And what I'm trying to do is to get educational institutions everywhere to become models of climate responsibility and models of actions by which they can do things in schools, colleges, universities, and also influence the community all around them. So you need nothing short of a revolution in thinking, and I believe the only way to bring that about is to have young people to design that revolution and to follow it. Thank you.
Тоді декілька питань, якщо ви не проти. Взагалі тема...
So the topic of climate change was very popular in the first 10 years of this century. 2007 was the most popular year for this topic. In 2010 there was one of the largest conferences on climate change in Copenhagen. If I'm not mistaken, I think that all the leaders of the countries were there. I was at your presentation there, and it seemed to me that governments came to certain agreements to lower the carbon emissions and the greenhouse gas emissions. And if you compare it with emissions from 1990, then there is a decrease In Germany, in the US, for example, we continued studying the greenhouse gas emission reduction. So please tell me, this reduction, have you seen already the effect of the reduction of greenhouse gas emission, or not sufficient amount of effort has been made? So has this effect been there? Has the reduction taken place? The reduction of pollution of the atmosphere, if I can say so. Have we been able to slow down this tendency, this process?
Well, unfortunately not, because carbon dioxide concentration levels are going up even today. And as I said, it was 2 years ago that we crossed 400 parts per million. And the other point that I'd like to make is that there's a huge lag between our actions today and the effects of those that take place in the future. Because of the past increase in concentration of these greenhouse gases, we will find that the impacts of climate change will continue for several decades. And therefore, we will have to adapt to those impacts because those are now inevitable. We can't avoid them. And this is something that we have to do. But if we don't if we don't reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases immediately, then the concentration of these gases will go up even further. And the impacts of climate change will become much, much more serious. So, to answer your question, yes, at this point of time, we are nowhere near stabilizing the concentration of these gases. They are still going up, and therefore we are nowhere near seeing a reduction in the impacts. In fact, the impacts in the last 2 or 3 years have been extremely serious. So we have to do a lot more.
Давайте поговоримо трошки про бізнес, який прилаштовується до
But let's speak about the business of climate change. So India is a very good example, which is dependent on the rains, seasonal rains, and also there is a snow cap of the Himalayas, and the glaciers of the Himalayas are melting, and the tendency has been there for the past 50 years. So how has India felt this climate change, and how has the agriculture of India changed and adapted to this climate change? Could you please share the experience?
Well, unfortunately, India has not been very serious in dealing with climate change. Of course, on the mitigation side, we have a commitment of 175 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity coming up by 2022. But I don't think we'll meet that commitment from the way things look at this point of time. But as far as the impacts are concerned, we have not really done enough to deal with these impacts and to adapt to them. Yes, the glaciers are melting very rapidly, and therefore, for some time, we'll get larger flows of water in the rivers. But once the volume of the glaciers has become much smaller, then some of these rivers will have much less water flowing through them. For agriculture, what has been a very serious problem is prolonged drought, as a result of which we find that in some parts of the country you've had 3 or 4 years of droughts, that means no rainfall at all. And these areas have very small farmers who produce just a little bit for their own consumption and their families, and maybe a little bit to sell in the market. And many of them have taken large loans from the banks. So one very tragic occurrence in India is a large number of suicides. These farmers commit suicide because once they borrow a lot of money, they are not able to produce anything for the next 2 or 3 years, then they are heavily in debt. They don't know what to do, how they would be able to pay back those loans. And there have been thousands of people who've committed suicide. And that, I think, is very sad. This also means a failure of our system because we obviously don't provide insurance for crop failure on a large enough scale. And as far as floods are concerned, there are large areas where, as I said, the impacts of climate change are very heavy precipitation events. So particularly during the monsoon months, we have floods in large parts of the country, and there again farmers lose very badly because they have crops which are more or less ready to harvest, and you have floods and their fields get flooded and all the crops get destroyed. So as far as agriculture is concerned, we have almost 650 million people dependent on agriculture, and their lives are really affected by climate change. And it will become much worse in the future.
Ну, з нашої точки зору, в Україні
From our point of view, Ukraine doesn't have such radical climate change. We have surveyed major agrarian companies of Ukraine to share the experience on adapting to climate change, and the result was very surprising for us. From 10 companies, 9 said that it's none of their business, they do not pay attention to it, they have no people who deal with this issue. One company said that they are harvesting now, and we can't share details with you, but we are thinking about it. And in general, the only impact that Ukraine feels at the moment is certain extreme weather changes, which have local effects. So agrarian companies do not take this matter seriously. And generally, Ukraine, from the point of view of climate change, has some moderate climate, which probably is an advantage to other countries. So maybe you could give us some piece of advice how we could use the situation of moderate climate, or maybe there will be some kind of migration in the future from extreme weather conditions areas. And so could you comment on this thing in terms of migration from these regions?
Yeah, I think internal migration as the result of climate change, and I think the country has to prepare for that. As far as the impacts of climate change are concerned on agriculture as a whole, to be quite honest, there aren't too many countries where research has been done on this. And I would suggest that this is an area that the government should fund rather quickly, because you are a large agricultural producer, and therefore the impacts of climate change, if they are going to be adverse, it requires that the government proactively takes steps by which things don't go out of hand 5 years or 10 years from now. And frankly, it requires a fair amount of research to understand what the impacts of climate change are on agriculture. I'm not too sure whether it's been done in this region or, for that matter, anywhere in the former Soviet Union. So the first thing to do would be to ensure that there is a detailed research project which is taken in hand, by which you can find out what the impacts of climate change will be in different parts of the country. Once you have that information and analysis, then of course you're in a position to take measures by which maybe some changes in cropping patterns, some changes in the use of water for agriculture, and in some cases you might even have to come up with different crops for different locations. We find in India, for instance, there are some parts of the country where they're growing sugarcane by using groundwater, and the groundwater table is going down. I mean, there's nothing more stupid than that. But, it's a cash crop. The farmers, who are generally rich farmers, make a lot of money, and they don't care what happens tomorrow, because if the groundwater goes down, it'll be somebody else's problem. They've made their quick money, and they'll probably sell off that land and walk away somewhere else. So I think these agricultural companies need to be regulated in some way, but that can only happen if you have enough research and enough information available on the impacts of climate change on agriculture in different locations. And I would suggest to the government that perhaps this should be done quickly.
Сподіваємось, наша держава
We will hope our country will be able to give some money for such research. And another topic discussed currently in the world is that oil and gas giants such as Shell, Royal Dutch, etc. Recently they've signed a historical agreement. I think you know about it. And they agreed to establish the first storage depository of carbon. Is this depository or storage place able to solve some issues, or is it just a science experiment so far?
Well, we are actually far behind in developing carbon capture and storage technology. You know, this work was started almost 20 years ago by Statoil, but they haven't really followed it seriously. And most of the oil companies have been doing a little bit, but I'm afraid we're far away from creating commercial solutions that would really make sense. To be honest, a lot of the fossil fuel industry has been rather negative about climate change. They've only bothered about immediate returns and immediate profits, and they have even attacked people who are talking about climate change, and I myself have been a victim of this. And this is the kind of thing that has happened even with the tobacco industry in the past. The tobacco industry tried very hard to plant doubt in the minds of people that there was no link between tobacco and cancer, lung cancer. And frankly, they were quite successful in doing that. And they have the power, they have the money, and I know for a fact, because I've suffered myself, you referred to Copenhagen, that was a time when the fossil fuel lobby was very active, and they very cleverly attacked the IPCC, they attacked me with all kinds of false charges. They have done that again. But this is part of their tactics, and I think if you are convinced about what you're doing, you have to hang in there. You don't run away from a battle. You fight it till the end. And that's what I'm trying to do.
This is great, but do you believe it is storage? I think it's...
Yes, I think storage technology is going to be essential. And I would like to see the oil companies and other companies accelerate their efforts. We must do this much faster because we're running out of time.
Ми тут говоримо часто про, взагалі, коли тема клімату,
When we speak of climate, we always say that governments should take some steps and introduce some regulations and limit development of oil companies. In the United States, there was a nice experiment. They introduced quotas on emissions of carbon emissions, and it led to acid rains. So there are some market mechanisms, and they managed to decrease the growing emission, the growing pollution of the atmosphere. And there was also Kyoto Protocol. This idea of introducing such quotas and mechanism, do you think it was successful, or are there any other mechanism that would help to minimize pollution? Sometimes market mechanisms are better than regulation.
Well, you could have a combination of both. For instance, in the US automobile industry, I think the CAFE standards for fuel efficiency have been quite effective, and they've worked very well in making sure that the efficiency of fuel use in vehicles is kept in sight when you come up with new automobiles. Of course, they left a loophole over there. The SUVs were not included in the mix of vehicles for each manufacturer. So the result is that SUVs are being used on a much larger scale than anyone had anticipated. But I think ultimately you need a mix of measures, and one thing that would work in my view and should have been introduced years ago is carbon taxes. Because unless you have a tax on carbon, you're not likely to get the kind of industry response or even the consumer response that is required. But ultimately, I think you have to educate people. And there, I think all these changes, policy changes, market mechanisms being introduced will only come about if people demand it. And it is young people who have to lead in that regard. It's their future. Otherwise, their future is really going to be ruined, and they have to be in the lead for bringing about change.
Ви залишили IPCC 2 роки тому.
We've heard about the project. What is your organization now dealing with? What are your major projects currently? What are you working on now?
I'm now engaged basically in two types of activities. I've set up something called the World Sustainable Development Forum, which is going to create consciousness among decision makers in politics, in business, in civil society. And the other is, as I mentioned, the POP movement, Protect Our Planet, which is working only with youth. So I've decided I'm not going to do anything else except concentrate on these two activities for the rest of my life. And these are both not for profit, and they are not very attractive for getting funds initially, but I'm relying on the understanding of people, I'm relying on the partnership of motivated organizations and individuals, and I'm getting a good response, and hopefully things will happen. Of course, the science of the IPCC is there. Everybody should understand that climate change, as Donald Trump says, is not a hoax, it's for real. He also says that it's a Chinese conspiracy. And I tell audiences everywhere that if that was the case, then I would be a Chinese citizen. But I'm not, and I would be looking Chinese, maybe.
Думаю, найбільш відома фраза доктора Пачурі – це про те, що один із
Your most popular phrase is the only place which does not know about the climate change is the White House, is your favorite phrase. Do you have any questions?
I have a question. Do you have within a forum of sustainable development any education project in which could be involved Ukrainian people, companies, civil organizations?
Yes, under the POP movement, we have prepared a lot of training material, and this is available, and I'd be very happy to share it with anyone. And we believe that business has to be an important part of this, because nothing's going to happen if business goes in a different direction. And fortunately, there are good companies where you have enlightened policies, and those can be held up as examples. In fact, if you look at companies that have been visionary in their efforts, and Vattenfall is one of them, they've done very well, even financially. If you look at a country, see Germany, look at the Nordic countries. I mean, they have been very focused on protecting the environment, but the level of economic welfare in those countries, to my mind, is higher than you would find anywhere else. So, yes, we have material, and I think companies should make use of it. We'll be very happy to share it with you.
Справді деякі успіхи дійсно є, тому що там в світі стає модним зелена технологія.
It has become fashionable to use green technology and environmentally friendly technologies. We are new organization also. I think your organization, which you are at the lead of, what do you think? If the fashion on green technologies will increase in the future, will this be an assistance for the countries to move on? Do you have any other questions? Thank you very much, Mr. Pachauri, for coming. I think Ukraine is so far Ukraine does not feel major climate change, but there are some processes, and thank you very much for your opinion, for your contribution.